I hope you can hear me properly. But I want to thank you all for coming today to this webinar, the first in our series on sort of exploring more themes around agriculture and sustainability within the agricultural sector. And so we're really honored to have Austin Barron here this morning. She's an agro-environmental specialist with Saskatchewan Agriculture and is currently based in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. So Austin, we're really glad to have you here today, and we're looking forward to what you have to share with us. And I will pause and say I do have to jump out at about half an hour, so Ian will facilitate the questions at the end. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start, and to save bandwidth, as we heard, I'm going to turn off my camera. So thank you everyone for attending. As you heard, my name is Austin Barron, and I'm the Agri-Environmental Specialist out of Swift Current. I grew up on a farm near Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan, and my parents did grain farming and cattle for a while when I was a kid, and then seeded all of our land to hay. So my parents really had a strong belief in allowing nature to thrive. They planted tree rows, they left strips in our hayfield to catch snow. They left rock piles, dugouts, old yards, and tried to encourage diversity on the farm. So I really grew up with a great appreciation for that diversity. When I went to the University of Saskatchewan, I continued to develop my love of soil and agriculture. When I convocated, I really wanted to find a way to marry my love of nature and soil and agriculture. And I think really that's how I landed on this topic of regenerative ag that I love so much. So there's so many different definitions of regenerative ag, which is probably why people get a little confused by this topic. It depends on who you talk to, what are their goals, what are their backgrounds. And I want to start this by saying I am by no means the guru of this topic, but I have made it my passion project through my work, and I talk about all things regenerative agriculture at every opportunity that I get. And I'm sure my family is tired of that, but they're stuck with it anyways. So today, you're also stuck with hearing my spin on things, and hopefully you leave this webinar with some new ideas, but also some questions, and go home and really think about regenerative ag. So just a brief outline of the things I want to go over today. I want to talk about the history and development of regenerative agriculture. I like talking about where we came from and where we are now. I want to talk about the regenerative agriculture movement, some of the practices on the farms that I'm so lucky to get to visit, along with my family farm, and some of the Saskatchewan agriculture projects that we have going on. So, first place, what is regenerative agriculture? As I said before, there's so many different definitions, but in my mind, regenerative agriculture really is not a new practice to Saskatchewan. The system uses practices that have been around for a really long time, but we're using them in a conservation and rehabilitation approach. With this way of farming, the main focus is regenerating topsoil and increasing soil health. Expected results are increasing biodiversity, improving water cycling, enhancing ecosystem services, supporting biosequestration or storing carbon, increasing resilience to climate change, and more. So, what is regenerative agriculture? It's not just one practice. We can't just pin it down to one thing. When talking about regenerative agriculture, realistically, it's various practices that are outcome-based and guided by several key principles. Some of the practices in the system can be recycling as much farm waste as possible or adding composted material from outside sources of the farm. The origin of regenerative ag is actually a organic term. In the 1980s, the Rodale Institute, which is a not-for-profit organization that leads in organic ag research, began using the term regenerative agriculture. Robert Rodale, the son of the Rodale Institute founder J.I. Rodale, said, "By marching forward under the banner of sustainability, we are, in effect, continuing to hamper ourselves by not accepting a challenging enough goal. I am not against the word sustainable, rather I favor regenerative agriculture. With that, there's some strong misconceptions that regenerative agriculture is an organic only tool. It is not. Though the principles started there, it's not an exclusive system. And some of these principles and approaches can be really helpful on conventional farms and definitely implemented on our conventional farms. So back to definitions. As I mentioned when we started with this regenerative agriculture love story, there are so many different definitions to regenerative agriculture. In simple terms, regenerative agriculture is a holistic approach to agriculture that focuses on the interconnection of farming systems and ecological systems as a whole. Um, every company dealing with regenerative agriculture seems to have a different definition. The Ministry of Agriculture Regenerative Agriculture Working Group went back and forth on this for what I felt like was forever to come up with our definition of regenerative agriculture, and we landed on this. Regenerative agriculture is improving agricultural productivity and profitability while maintaining efficiency and long-term resiliency by adopting farming principles that rehabilitate and preserve ecosystem functionality. In other words, farming systems that use various practices that focus on regenerating soil by using the 5 core principles. So, in essence, we just circle back to improving soil health. Um, and really, is that soil sustaining plant life? Is it cycling nutrients in water? Is it storing carbon? Is it resistant to erosion from wind and water? Where I live and work, water erosion is not something we see a whole lot, but let me tell you, we have wind. And if our soils are not able to stay in place, someone else is going to be receiving all of our topsoil. So that is one way to look at it. So the core principles of regenerative agriculture. Again, depending on who's talking about regenerative agriculture, the number of principles may vary. Some include reduction of artificial fertilizers and synthetic pesticides, though these usually align more with the organic folks, and that's okay. But when I speak to regenerative agriculture, I like to lead toward the 5 principle system, as I find it more inclusive for both organic and conventional. So the 5 principles that I like to talk about are minimizing soil disturbance, keeping soil covered, maintaining a living root system as long as possible, maximizing crop diversity, and integrating livestock. And then I also think there is a 6th principle, and to me, it is the most important, and that is context. What works on my farm may not work on your farm, and it may not work on the neighbor's farm, and that is okay. Depending on the goal of your farm, depending on the location of the farm, all of that can change which principles you focus on, and how these things all look and work. So there are a lot of common practices that have been implemented in Saskatchewan for a really long time. We see lots of cocktail cover cropping and incorporation of winter annuals, zero or minimum till, which has been going on for a long time. According to the 2016 census, 93% of cropland acres in Saskatchewan were managed under some sort of conservation tillage. Mob grazing, so high intensity, low frequency, or adaptive multi-paddock grazing, multi-species grazing or relay grazing, following cows with pigs, then with chickens, intercropping, and then winter grazing to extend that grazing season. So moving into policies, consumers, and some of the companies that we see these practices sitting with. As regenerative agriculture is gaining traction on the market, I think it's fairly reasonable to say that it's being driven by consumer demand. We see a lot of interest in how food is being produced, and a lot of consumers want to purchase food they feel good about or they feel was produced in a sustainable manner. But we also see a drive coming from our producers wanting to make a difference, and I'll touch on that in a bit. But for now, I want to highlight some of the large companies or companies I have seen in action and their regenerative agriculture movements. And by no means, these are not the only companies doing this type of work. These are just the ones that I have worked with. So in 2018, we saw several large food companies in the United States come together and form the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance to advance US government climate policies. So their emphasis was on addressing soil health, water quality, and renewable energy. In 2019, General Mills announced its intention to advance regenerative agriculture practices on 1 million acres of farmland for oats, wheat, corn, dairy, and then sugar beets as well in the northern Great Plains, which included North Dakota, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The cool part about this initiative is I have seen it on farm in practice. There's some producers more on the eastern side of Saskatchewan that I've got to tour their farms, and they are growing oats for the General Mills project. The General Mills program is focusing on soil health, biodiversity, and farm economics. And they're partnering with both organic and conventional, which I think is really important. In 2020, Cargill joined the regenerative agriculture movement. They're supporting a farmer-led effort to adopt regenerative agriculture practices on 10 million acres across North America farmland over the next 10 years. They're really focusing on row crop rotations, and they're partnering with Walmart, A&W, Alice Canada, and the Soil Health Institute, and a couple of other companies to reach that 10 million acre goal. And then finally, Terramera is a global company, but they're headquartered in BC. They're planning on bringing clean technology to farmers and ranchers in an initiative to fight climate change. They're investing a lot of money to help Canadians achieve emission reductions, create new jobs, and generate economic activity. They're really focused on data and are working with Microsoft and looking at addressing reliable soil carbon quantification and data while reducing costs. So they're a pretty neat company. I've heard them talk a few times, and I find them very interesting. If you have the chance, I highly recommend listening to some of their chats. So now that we know what consumers are asking for and what companies are hoping their producers move towards, I think it's important to talk about what we're seeing on farm. As I mentioned before, according to the 2016 and the 2021 census, we had over 29.6 million acres in Saskatchewan in a no-till or zero-till system. It also told us that about 6.7 million acres retain most crop residue on the surface, which is actually down from the 2016 census, which had over 7 million acres in this category. But that could have changed just due to input costs, feeding requirements, things like that. But with keeping this zero-till or no-till systems, keeping that residue on the land is really important. We can help buffer moisture loss and temperature fluctuations. Next, we are seeing lots of polycrops and intercrops. So they're gaining lots of traction. I use the terms interchangeably, or when I'm thinking intercrops, I'm really thinking just two crops like peas and oats. And then to me, polycrops have at least 3 species or more. So they can be as simple as the 2 species or as complex as 19 or more. When I speak with producers who are potentially interested in exploring some of the regenerative ag practices, this is always where I like to start. There's been tons of research on intercropping. Dr. Gillian Baynard with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, who was previously based out of Swift Current, was looking at the implications of intercropping. Lana Shaw out of the Southeast Research Farm at Redverse has done tons of work on intercropping. There are many noted agronomic benefits to intercropping, including potential fertility benefits, reduction of disease and pests, and more. There's several uses to these intercrops. They can be grown for grain production, for grazing or haying, or as a green manure plowdown. Depending on the producer goals, I've seen both. This ties into the living roots principle of the regenerative agriculture ideas. And depending on what's included in the seed mix, some of those plants may overwinter and hit on keeping the living roots in the soil the longest. When I discuss farming with my brother-in-law, who's really my sounding board for a lot of my ideas in agriculture, he told me that he thought regenerative ag might be a big idea for some producers to take on. And then he asked, where would I start? And like I said before, this is where I'd start. If you want to start simple, you can go with 2 species. If you really want to start with something a little wilder, you can buy some of the pre-mixed species or pre-mixed mixes that have 19 species or more. If you start with a simple mix, you can easily separate the 2 grains. And if that works, then next year you can add another species in there. So, integration of livestock. In my opinion, this is one of the harder principles for many producers. A lot of the annual grain crop producers can see how to incorporate extending their rotations and no-till into their operations, but this is a bit more of a sticking point. Back to that conversation I was having with my brother-in-law, he told me that this would be the hardest spot for him. He doesn't have livestock on their operation as they're straight grain farmers. And he told me it'd be hard for him to let someone on their land that may not treat it with the same respect that they have. So my question when I talk to people about starting regenerative ag is how do you start those conversations? When incorporating livestock or being allowed to graze on your neighbor's land, you'll not only be building your on-farm sustainability, but you'll be building those important relationships that can benefit both operations. Both sides stand to gain from this. Livestock producers need those grazing acres, but annual crop producers may also receive some economic incentive and nutrient deposition from the livestock on the land. Studies have shown that beef cattle excrete approximately 90% of the nitrogen they uptake through their feed, and 50% of that is excreted in a form that is readily available to plants. Integrating livestock can be done in many ways. You can swath graze, you can aftermath graze, stubble grazing. And if it works for your operation and your neighbors, if you're working with someone else, that is the right option. So it's always important to circle back to that context piece. So rotational grazing is another practice that is gaining a lot of popularity. Rotational grazing can go by other names, deferred grazing, AMP, that adaptive multi-paddock grazing, high intensity low duration. And in my mind, this action is moving towards mimicking the movements of the bison. Depending on different grazing styles, different amounts of forage are encouraged to be taken off. One of the most common theories is to take 1/3, leave 1/3, and then trample 1/3. So the most important factor in this practice is to remember the rest provided for your rangeland. Different forages require different rest periods and different recovery periods. So as a producer, it's super important to know what's on your farm. So again, we circle back to context. Rotational grazing can be as intricate or as easy as it works for you. I've seen producers that maybe make 10 paddocks on their farm and they rotate through starting on a different paddock every year. But I've also seen a really cool operation where they had a ton of 8-acre paddocks with a single strand wire to contain their cattle with fence lifters on timers. So after so many hours, the lifter raised the wire and the cattle knew to walk under and go to fresh grass. So that is really cool. But again, what works on your farm? Do you have a certain amount of time you want to invest in your operation? Do you have the time to move your cattle every 2 hours? Maybe you don't. That's okay. So now we circle back to Saskatchewan agriculture and regenerative ag. In the fall of 2020, Saskatchewan Ag formed a regenerative agriculture working group. For me, it really started with a few forward-thinking producers asking questions about how regenerative agriculture could work on their operations. They were doing some of the principles and wanted to expand further into the regen ag realm. I knew I wasn't going to be the only producer or only specialist in the ministry hearing these questions. So I started bugging some of the other specialists. and we formed a regenerative agriculture working group. Initially, it started in regional services, and we had specialists from the livestock group, the range management group, the crops group, the ag programs group, and my group, the agri-environmental specialists, along with the provincial forage specialist and the alternative cropping specialist. But then we were gaining some interest from other parts of SaskAg, and we got to have colleagues from policy branch and research branch. So that was really neat. We had a very diverse approach to this and lots of eyes on the project. So I felt like this group was really going to accomplish some amazing things. And we did. We created our internal definitions, so we were all on the same page. We put together a mandate. And originally, we thought we'd be able to do some big projects together as a group. But as you may have gathered from my list, there were a ton of people involved, which meant a lot of moving parts. Ultimately, we decided that the regenerative agriculture group should live with the agri-environmental specialists within regional services, which was excellent for me because I just kept bugging everyone with this. But now I know who throughout the ministry is interested in this topic and who I can go to for backup when it comes to policy questions or livestock-based questions. So our ministry also gets to fund and partake in some really cool projects that I feel fit well with the regenerative agriculture focus. Some of the strategic field projects that have been funded in the past years that fit well with the scope of our Regen Ag principles are forage variety demonstrations, overseeding legumes into tame pastures, and annual forage variety assessments, just to name a few. We also get to partake in ADOPT projects, which stands for the Agricultural Demonstration of Practices and Technologies. Some of the projects that we've worked with in the past are fertilizing forages and testing grazing software, which has been really cool. And then some of the new projects we've submitted that are pending approval is a project assessing high diversity versus simple mix cover crops. And that'll be looking at establishment of the species in the diverse mix, and then also following the fertility status of growing these crops. And then there's also a project going on or submitted for approval more in the north, but they're looking at converting marginal acres to forage and looking at the impact on pollinators, soil health, and the economic benefit. So with SaskAg, we have the privilege of partnering with some outside organizations to conduct some of these projects. And again, this list is not complete. These are just the organizations that I've worked with directly very recently. So there is a ton of other organizations that support our work and that we get to work with. So first, I'd like to highlight the University of Saskatchewan. Bobby Helgeson and Tristan Skolrud were looking at economic implications of implementing some of these regenerative agriculture practices. So that's really neat. Maurice Bourgault, who is also at the U of S, is looking at soil implications of some of these practices. And I also get to sit with her on the SAS Soil Board. In Swift Current, we are really lucky to have the research station with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Dr. Jillian Baynard was there. She unfortunately left for BC, but she was looking at cover cropping and helping bring some of those best management practices to producers. Dr. Aklilu Alamu and Dr. Alan Awasa are looking at grazing implications of these practices. Dr. Michelle Hubbard looks at intercropping to manage root rot and Ascochyta blight in chickpeas. We have a newer research specialist there by the name of Dr. Francois Tate, who specializes in soil microbiology. And he's looking at doing some projects on improving intercropping and using microbes to rehabilitate saline soils. We also get to work with some really awesome not-for-profit groups such as SAS Forage Council, SAS Soil, and the watershed groups. The group that I work with the most is the Swift Current Creek Watershed. We work with these groups on ADOPT projects to put out events and more things like that. I have the privilege of sitting on the SAS Soil Board of Directors, and it's so empowering for me to get to work with a group of like-minded people who are so innovative and forward-thinking. And that group is really cool because it's not just researchers, but it's also producers. So I love getting to do that. Um, Though I work in extension and the whole purpose of my job is to interact with producers, partnering with these groups allows us to reach producers in a different way. So, as you may have gathered, I'm not much of a fortune teller, but I spend a lot of time thinking and clearly talking about regenerative agriculture. So, I have some thoughts on where these practices might land and what's going to influence that. So right now, we see that the cost of production is really high. Margins are tight on farm for most people. So to me, regenerative agriculture offers an option to widen those margins. Regenerative agriculture gives producers another option. If you're including a second seed in your seed mix that allows you to reduce fertilizer while still growing a high value product, maybe that's a really good option for your farm. It might not work on every farm, but it could be an option. Um, I also feel as though consumers are going to continue asking for an indication that their food is grown in a sustainable and healthy manner. Um, Conventional farmers and producers know that we produce food in a safe and healthy and sustainable way, but it's important to talk about that. And I think regenerative agriculture really feeds into that public trust piece. And that's something else I'm really passionate about. Many producers do these practices, but by acknowledging them, we can say, hey, this is something that I'm doing to make sure I'm part of the solution. So then my final point on future direction. This year, I had the privilege of attending the Outstanding Young Farmers Award Banquet in Saskatoon. I got to listen to all of the presentations from across Canada. For anyone that doesn't know, there's 7 regions across Canada, and each of these regions awards one producer this Outstanding Young Farmer Award, and then they come together and there are 2 awards, one for the West and one for the East. So this was the first year that I got to attend, and I got to listen to everyone present on how they were making their industry better and doing their best to serve their consumers, communities, and families. I clearly have a deep love for our agriculture industry, but this event was so great. I have never been so proud of our industry, and I honestly felt like agriculture was headed in such a great direction after this. Um, and I have to admit, I was extra proud that our Saskatchewan winners were Cody Straza and Allison Squires, but they actually also won the Western Canada Award. So that was really great. I've worked with them in Southern Saskatchewan before, and they do some really awesome things on their farms. But there were really 2 points that stuck with me during this whole event. Um, when Allison was talking about their farm, Edwood Mountain, she said, apply your passion to what you're doing and build on that. And that point really struck me as how I get stuck on the 6th principle of regenerative ag, of context. Your passions and goals will guide you to do what's best on your farm. And it's not always going to be the same as everyone else's, and that's okay. And then the other point that I really held on to was the winner from Alberta, Ben Campbell. He was a great speaker, and anyone that has the opportunity to listen to him, I highly recommend it. Um, but the sparks notes of this one was that originally he was an engineer and a vegetarian. He was working for Engineers Without Borders, and when he came home, he wanted to do something that was good for the world, so he started raising cattle. Um, I highly recommend anyone that can listen to this. But at the end of his talk, he was speaking about his family, and he said, I don't have to teach my kids to work hard, but I have to teach my kids to love things. And that really wrapped up the whole day of the Outstanding Young Farmer Awards for me, because every presentation focused on the importance of their families and leaving something for their children. And for me, that's what a big part of regenerative agriculture is. When I think back to where regenerative agriculture started for me, it was with my family, and that makes sense. My parents did that for me. They instilled that passion for the environment and our industry. And now you're all stuck to listening to that passion as well. So I'd really like to thank you for your time. I know I'm a little short of 45 minutes, but I would like to open it up for questions.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Austin. That was a great presentation, and it's really great to see some of the things that are happening out there. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm curious what the perspective is on insecticidal and fungicidal seed treatments. Often, most often not applied by the farmer. They're on the seed when they're purchased. Farmers don't have a lot of choice for certain crops like canola. It's like you take the seed treatment or you don't plant canola. How does regenerative agriculture deal with like insecticidal, fungicidal seed treatments that have impacts on soil health, on the microorganisms in the soil?
I really can't speak to that. That would be more of a question for one of our crop specialists or an agronomist. I'm sorry, I can't speak to that one.
Yeah, I guess it's something that, I mean, if you're in regenerative cropping, it must be something that if you don't have a choice on it, do you just say we don't have a choice, or because it is still in the regenerative ag? If you're planting crops, you kind of have to deal with seed treatments.
And I guess maybe that circles back around to how, when you do regenerative ag, are you saying you have to do all of the principles? Or are you implementing some as you go? If you don't have the option to do all of the principles right now, you do your best with what you can do. Maybe down the road, that's something you tackle, but I know that's not a great answer, but.
No, I appreciate that. That's good. Thanks.
Susie, go ahead.
Thank you, Austin. That was great. That was wonderful. I have a question for you regarding livestock and the integration of livestock. And yes, there are challenges to it for all sorts of reasons. But you focused in what you presented to us on the beef cattle. But there are other livestock in Saskatchewan, for example, hogs, where crop farmers, straight grain farmers, actually do use hog manure. In your discussions within your Saskatchewan agriculture group, did you talk about other livestock species and how to facilitate the utilization of waste products on a broader scale?
That hasn't been something we have necessarily covered. It is like with some of our programs, we're trying to encourage people to use sheep or goats for grazing invasive species. I think that could all go hand in hand. It's just something we haven't got to yet. And I really speak about beef cattle because that's what I see most and what my producers are doing most. But I did touch on like the relay grazing, where there are definitely proven benefits of following beef cattle with pigs or chickens. I think it's just something we need to spend more time looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Erica, go ahead.
Hi, Austin. Nice to see you again. Thanks for the presentation. That was great. So you had mentioned there are lots of companies that are interested in regenerative ag and making claims about regenerative ag and commitments. I'm wondering, do you know of ones that are actually trying to certify or verify that regenerative ag is being used in their supply chain? And if so, do you know how they are doing on-farm verification, since it's more about principles versus practices? So how they kind of verify against outcomes? Thanks.
So right now I'm fairly certain that the only regenerative agriculture certification system is actually in the organic side. So that's something definitely to look at moving forward as an industry. But I know General Mills is working with smaller consulting companies almost in Saskatchewan that are working on farm with the producers that go through the whole process with them. So that's kind of the only side that I know of. Terra Mera was some of their soil testing equipment and such. They are working with local agronomists and they're trying to work towards that. But that's the only part that I am aware of.
Thanks, Austin.
Go ahead, Jim.
Hi, yeah, great presentation. I was just wondering if anybody, what I've seen in Manitoba anyway, is they're in the fall with all these different crops that are planted. It's like a utopia for wildlife. And I'm just wondering if anybody's kind of looking at it from that perspective. I mean, all the different, it's almost like, hey, if I was a wildlife enthusiast, whether you hunt or just like wildlife on your land and want to help them out as far as food for them, holy smokes, man, you got sunflowers, oats, wheat, corn, you name it, it's all there. And I mean, I remember walking through a field near Langreuth in Manitoba, actually looking for sharp-tailed grouse, but I was blown away by this. And is anybody kind of looking at it from that perspective at all, do you know?
So that may be looked at more in the environmental side, being that I focus in agriculture. That's not something I necessarily have looked at, but we definitely acknowledge that biodiversity across the landscape is really important. Like just having the different roots in the ground is important, and that's good for the different microbes and things that live in the ground. But that's all I can speak to on that.
Well, thanks and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
If there are any other questions, please feel free to either type them into the chat box or raise your hand. Susie, go ahead.
Yeah, I have so many questions. I don't want to hog the whole thing, but let's talk about cover crops. First of all, I'm with the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, and we had a lot of discussions with farmers over the last 3 years. We were putting together a code of practice, and you know, soil health is a really critical part of it. And in terms of the living roots, I really like the approach that you have taken, as long as possible. Can you talk a little bit more about that, why you came up with as long as possible and what you think the range of those possibilities are in Saskatchewan, for example?
Sure. This also, for this one, like there's tons of options for what we want to use as cover crops. If you want to use annuals, that's great. We see different seeding practices, whether you want to seed in the shoulder seasons, so like fall when you're not growing your main cash crop, there's the options there. If you choose to use perennials or biennials, then you can have those living roots in the ground longer, which are really great. But it really comes back to what works on your farm. If you have the ability to spray those perennials out, maybe that's a really great option for you. But if you're doing an organic system and you're concerned about having some of those longer lived species in there that may become weedy in your cash crops following, maybe you don't want to seed those perennial species in there. So you have different options that way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really kind of enlightened approach that it is the longest possible. And one of the comments we got back is, you know, it's hard to seed in frozen ground for cover crops, and the concern about moisture and the fact that there wouldn't be enough moisture. So the idea of your context, I think, actually echoes everything that we heard in our discussions with farmers about it. It's all about what you're dealing with
And that's
on your own farm.
with that adopt project about seeding cover crops and looking at those diverse species. It would be focused in the southwestern part of Saskatchewan. So we hear lots of the initial ideas behind this regenerative ag coming from like Gabe Brown, who's in South Dakota, I believe. And though the climate is quite close there, they don't have the same winters that we have. So things that work down there may not necessarily work here. So we have to figure out a way to adapt those principles to work here. And then back to context being the most important principle in this whole scheme of things.
Yes, you definitely answered my question. Thank you.
No problem.
Glenn, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'll echo, excuse me, Austin, a great presentation, very enlightening. There was a question earlier I thought I would add to, and it's one that we've been thinking about here in Manitoba as well, and it's around how do you measure regenerative agriculture, and how are companies talking about it? And I think you had a spot on answer, Austin, that it's I think it's in flux, and it varies depending on the company and and there's many factors. But what I've learned of, there's a few that have come out and have created a metric system called regenerative agriculture, a few companies on the retail side or on the ingredient side, and they're not, they're different. They're not adopted across scale, but there are these measuring systems out there. And I know that the National Index for Performance, which many on this call are a part of, is trying to understand what some of the environmental indicators are that might lead to or tell a story of sustainability. But this is the, I think, a bit of a nexus here on talking about what regen means in the context of sustainability and creating a metric system. And we are also trying to get our heads around it and what it means in Manitoba and how we can support that movement so that it's relevant within Canada and within international markets. Thinking of a name of one that came out quite early on this, and it is sort of it's within the Alan Savory group, but the Land to Market initiative is something they have a verification system in place with a set of outcomes that looks, and you could call it third party, but at the end of the day, most of the efforts are all within a vertically integrated supply chain within a retail or a ingredient supplier company's supply chain. Good question, and certainly something worth looking into and getting some answers for.
And I think the difficult part about this is we don't know exactly what we're trying to measure because there's so many different definitions. It makes it really hard to track this. And to me, like I love the data side of things. I love having numbers to look at and to compare. But what I recommend for my producers that are trying this is take soil samples, take measurements, take as much data as you can. And even if at the end of the day, you're like, well, this information really means nothing to me. You don't know that data is going to mean nothing until the end of the day. And maybe it's going to show you something great, and maybe we will learn something from that. But for now, I encourage take all the samples you can and make all the notes that you can.
If I may ask a follow-up question,
Sure.
don't want to intrude on others if there's a lineup I can't see, but how are you looking at what do you see the role of digital agriculture and sort of that technology around or within regenerative agriculture or sustainable agriculture? What's your opinion on that? And yeah.
So like using the detailed maps and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Anything within the digital ag or artificial intelligence, like what in innovation in that space, where do you see a role for that, or do you see a role? Are you seeing producers using that technology to better adopt regenerative agriculture practices or sustainable ag practices? Are you
Yeah.
seeing that being a factor, because it's complicated and complex in some cases, and also expensive to invest in that technology. So do you see their interest in sustainable practices as an avenue or as the catalyst to make that decision to invest in it, or as a barrier, or is it not needed?
So I definitely think it's an avenue that producers can explore. There is a really cool farm that I got to tour up by Melfort. And what this producer was he had his whole farm variable rate mapped. And in the low producing areas, he seeded cover crops because nothing else was growing there. So he seeded these cover crops there. His sprayer was set to these variable rate maps. So if he was growing canola on his good ground, then he had like turnips and sugar beets growing in the saline areas that could help use that salinity up. And then he was also, that came up as like a pollinator area. So he was getting benefits from that. So that's really cool. And we see more producers moving towards those variable rate maps. And that's something that's becoming more popular in agriculture. So I think that has a really big opportunity to play into our regenerative ag stuff here. I've only seen that on that farm. So that was really cool, but maybe other people are doing that elsewhere. So I think there's an opportunity there. And I guess the digital ag movement really feeds into just producers having more information at their fingertips. And being able to have that information can help you make these more leading edge decisions, I guess. Does that answer your question?
It does. Sorry, it does. Thank you. I wasn't sure if I'm waiting for others, but yeah, it does. I'm wondering, is that something that are you seeing in your extension? You're talking about how that data is helpful, or how, like you mentioned the economics group earlier in your conversation. That was really helpful, a helpful team to have. But is that where you're seeing the benefit in the digital ag, is allowing you to crunch some of those economics, or yeah, maybe a bit more on that?
It's not something I have looked at myself. The university may have more data on that, or Lana Shaw, like the people doing more of the larger scale research. I know that producers that I see doing these principles say it's making an economic difference, but I don't have hard data on that.
Good, thank you. I look forward to following your work.
Awesome.
There doesn't appear to be any more questions, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Austin for her presentation today, and I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. If anybody else does have questions that they think of after the presentation, please feel free to contact John, and he'll certainly get in touch with Austin, or follow up with Austin with their contact information here on the screen. We look forward to seeing you at our next PHJAB webinar. Thank you, everyone.